Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dr. Hal Needham. On Wednesday, August 31st, 2016, I'm going to give a brief presentation on an overview of Tropical Storm Hermine Storm Surge. So I'm the director for the Center of Coastal Heritage and Resiliency at the Galveston Historical Foundation. Sometimes on nights and weekends, I get to have a little fun doing some storm surge consulting. I run a business called Marine Weather and Climate, and I also run the U-Surge project. This is an initiative to build storm surge climatology for 50 U.S. cities. And so far, we've been able to do that for about 6 cities, and we're growing all the time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that plays into looking at storm surge climatology and understanding the risk from Tropical Storm Hermine Storm Surge. So this afternoon, finally, after much waiting and much anticipation, we had Invest 99L for a long time coming through the Northern Caribbean. That became Tropical Depression number 9. And finally this afternoon, with intense convection, after some time, we had the Hurricane Center named Tropical Storm Hermine. They're forecasting that Hermine will track slowly and then increase in forward speed towards the northeast, approaching Apalachee Bay and cities like Apalachicola. We're also looking at some storm surge impacts over by Cedar Key and some other communities north of Tampa. I just want to talk to you about 2 communities in particular here along the Big Bend of Florida. I want to talk about Apalachicola and Cedar Key. Also, I should note some of the latest models show that high pressure may build here. So sort of Hermine kind of had a train track getting out of this whole area, but it was delayed a little bit, maybe missed the train. It looks like there may be some high pressure building in here. So Hermine's going to quickly move in up along the Atlantic coast, and some of the models are saying that it could actually turn back towards the coast, sort of like a little bit like what Hurricane Sandy did in 2012 as far as making that left-hand track. But again, a lot remains to be seen. Right now in this presentation, I'm just going to focus here on Florida. I'll get to the East Coast, I think, later this week and this weekend, depending on what happens. Again, the 2 communities I wanted to look at here are south of Tallahassee, north of Tampa. So this is Cedar Key and Apalachicola. I talked about the U-Surge project providing storm surge data for 50 U.S. cities. 2 of them are Apalachicola and Cedar Key, and fortunately there are 2 of them that are already completed in this project. So Apalachicola has a tide gauge provided by NOAA. I believe it's been there since 1996 working faithfully, and what it actually does is it shows over time a blue line, which is the predicted water level based on the relationship between the Earth and the Moon and some other things. But it also shows a red water level, which are the actual water levels. And so the difference between the red and the blue is a storm surge. And this shows that this afternoon, the water was actually recorded at 2 feet above some datum or vertical line called NAVD88. We won't get into that right now, but just if we make NAVD88 at 0, the water level was 2 feet above 0, but it was predicted to be at about a ½ foot. And so the storm surge was 1.5 feet. The water was 1.5 feet higher than it should have been, with a total water level from the storm and from tides of around 2 feet. So that is what we call a storm tide. It reached about 2 feet this afternoon. And what concerns me is that we have several high tide levels coming up here. So looking in time, this is Thursday morning at midnight. This is Thursday at noon. It looks like around Thursday late afternoon, maybe from around 4 to 6 or 7 o'clock, we're going to see another high tide. And I think with this storm, that may be a time that is really of concern with some storm surge and storm tide inundation around Apalachicola. It's interesting how we already have 1.5 feet of storm surge, even though the storm, was still centered here just north of the Yucatan Peninsula. And part of that is, I was looking at the wind observations for Apalachicola this morning. The winds were not really that intense. They were blowing from the east at about 5 to 10 miles an hour. Really 2 reasons why water is already piling up. One, and this is something that's a little bit counterintuitive, there's something called Ekman transport. When winds are blowing from east to west, the water tends to turn to the right of that. And so often a strong east wind here along the northern Gulf Coast will actually pile up water from Texas all the way to the Florida Panhandle. So that may have a little bit to do with the higher water levels in Apalachicola area. But if you look here east of what was Tropical Depression 9 and what is now Tropical Storm Hermine, we see these strong south winds. And what happens is they, push water up here along the west coast of Florida, and the water more or less gets trapped in here around Apalachee Bay, and some of these other areas are very efficient for trapping water. In some of the major hurricanes we've seen in recent years, like Hurricane Dennis in 2005 and Alma in 1966, we see what's called a shelf wave, which often is where water gets trapped between the storm and between the Florida Peninsula, and actually it can really elevate water levels in here. I don't really know if we have a shelf wave per se going on yet, but we have strong south winds that are pushing water up into this area, and so we're already seeing elevated water in places like Apalachicola and Cedar Key. So again, here we are. This was slightly after noon on Wednesday. We go into a low tide tonight or just before midnight. But again, I'm looking at late tomorrow afternoon, 4, 5, 6 o'clock. I think that may be of concern as storm surge builds, and we also have a high tide here in Apalachicola. Talking about water levels, I want to encourage you to go to www.usurge.net. If you go to surge data, you can actually go to Apalachicola and you will see something that is literally hot off the press. I just produced this morning. This is a storm surge climatology at Apalachicola. This shows data from 1900 through present. Every dot here is an actual storm tide event measured again above that line again that we call NAVD88. And this big blue polygon is actually the sea level, which is rising over time. And so some of the highest water levels that have been recorded in Apalachicola, one from an unnamed storm in 1903, where the storm surge was actually about 10 feet above sea level. But again, sea levels were lower back then, so we don't quite reach the 10 mark for today. But Hurricane Elena in 1985 was also about a 10-foot storm surge, and that's a little higher than 1903 because of sea level rise. Hurricane Dennis in 2005 produced a storm tide of slightly more than 7 feet. And again, we see a lot of these other events that maybe go without names. We have 38 events now in the storm surge climatology for Apalachicola. You may notice a lot of these lower magnitude events since the mid-90s. That's really because of two reasons. Number one, again, we have this faithful NOAA gauge that's been doing a great job recording water levels since 1996. And also, since about 1995, we've seen a positive phase of the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, which is just a fancy term to say sea surface temperatures in the Atlantic have been running warmer than normal for the past 2 decades, give or take. And we've seen a more active hurricane climatology than the long-term record. So we've seen a lot of tropical activity in the past 2 decades. We also have a tide gauge, so I think that's partly why we see a lot of these low magnitude surge events. Here's Hurricane Dennis, and Dennis is interesting because, probably no one alive today remembers the, 1903 event. Elena and Dennis are more recent, but Dennis was just 11 years ago, so a lot of people in Apalachicola still remember that storm. Very different than Hermine. This came right out of the Caribbean and never stopped. It crossed Cuba and came up intensified to a Category 4 hurricane before making landfall near the Florida-Alabama border. And this again produced one of these shelf waves where we had storm surge levels around 10 feet or so in Apalachee Bay. The storm tide reached about 7 feet or a little higher than that in Apalachicola. So a little different than Hermine, but just a fairly recent event that people would remember the water levels. And again, this becomes important because it's fairly recent. And I really think, looking at Hermine's storm tide, I think we could see storm tides around 6 to 7 feet from Hermine, depending on the track. Now the track, the National Hurricane Center will give a cone of uncertainty, and depending on different storms, this was a storm that spun. It was stationary for a long time. It was kind of hard to determine the exact center of circulation, so the models may be off a little bit to the right or left, but in general, I think that we have the potential here for 6 to 7 feet of storm tide based on an intensifying tropical cyclone that is still forecast to approach hurricane force as it approaches Apalachee Bay. For reference, Tropical Storm Colin just in June produced a storm tide of 3.25 feet in Apalachicola. So again, this may be something that people there are more familiar with. This just happened about 3 months ago, 2 or 3 months ago. It should have produced some minor storm surge flooding, but nothing really major. Hermine will be several feet above that. And again, what I would love to do eventually is to have a map where I can say this is what 6 feet, this is what 7 feet of storm tide above NAVD 88 would flood. I don't have that yet. But on the USurge site, we can take a storm like Hurricane Dennis that's in fairly recent memory, and we can actually look at pictures and video of what flooded during Dennis. And so these are pictures from USurge, and I got them from an original source. You can see the citation if you go to USurge and click on that. But again, Dennis produced some pretty substantial water in the streets of Apalachicola. 7 feet of storm tide will take you to about this level in Apalachicola. So again, I think Hermine could sort of approach that level. I don't really think it's going to exceed Dennis Dennis's storm tide, but it may be sort of a little lower or getting up near that ballpark, so we should be concerned about storm surge inundation with Hermine. The National Hurricane Center has produced some fabulous products that are launched this year, products that I am certainly very excited about. You can go to a given storm and click on storm surge inundation. You can also click on storm surge watch or warning. I'm really excited about the storm surge watch and warning because often we tend to think of hurricanes just as this one hazard, but it's really multiple hazards. We have rainfall, we have storm surge, and we have strong winds. And so it's really nice to see a storm surge watch and warning produced as well. Looking at the storm surge inundation map, so you can actually go on their website, you can look at inundation maps, and this is fabulous because it really is very pinpoint. Everybody wants to know what's going to happen at their location, and that's what the National Hurricane Center is taking on with this. So again, this is looking at likely inundation above ground level. If you have at least a 10% chance of being flooded to a certain elevation, they're mapping that out. This is zooming in on the Apalachicola area. So east of Apalachicola, we see some water levels 3 feet or more above ground level. In the Apalachicola area, we see mostly blue, so mostly 1 foot above ground level in the lower areas. In many areas around the city, what this product is saying is that we should not really have some storm tide inundations. Again, these are based on modeling, on something called slosh modeling, which is very well respected. I honestly, when I glanced at this, I was a little surprised not to see more yellow and a greater coverage of blue in this area, just because the winds will be prolonged for more than a day and really intensifying, sort of pushing water. In fact, I'll show you why I was thinking that in a moment. And I'm sorry, this is the area that is under the storm surge warning. So this is great that we have this warning produced that's separate than looking at just winds. I wanted to explain why I'm a little concerned with the storm tide again in Apalachicola. This is looking at the cyclonic vorticity and the geopotential height. So basically what is shaded here in yellow has to do with vorticity. The really like the reds and yellows, we're looking at more spin here. And this comes from the Tropical Tidbits website. If you've ever followed Levi and some of the work he's doing, it's absolutely fabulous. This was the GFS model initialized this morning, and this was run for this afternoon. So again, we see some spin happening here, but we see that increasing and approaching with the GFS model. They're talking about that approaching the Apalachicola area, moving into, this would be around midnight on going into Friday. What concerns me is, again, these strong south winds just piling water up here in Appalachia Bay, and then where this storm does make landfall, you're basically pounding those already elevated waters into some community. Again, we can't pinpoint this. It may be at Apalachicola, it may be by Cedar Key or St. Mark's, or even over towards Panama City, but I really think that there is some heightened surge potential, even if this is only a tropical storm, because we're going to have prolonged winds for more than a day, piling water up and then driving it into the coast wherever this makes landfall. This is looking at the European model. This was initialized last night, and this is for predicting where they thought the storm would be centered on Thursday evening. And again, it gets pretty dangerously close there in this model run to Apalachicola. It could be right of there or left of there, but again, I think we could really see water pile up and then be driven into shore. So I was a little surprised not to see more inundation on the National Hurricane Center product. I was thinking 6 to 7 feet of storm tide may be reasonable, and that would be roughly 6 to 7 feet above ground level, because mean sea level and the NAVD 88 datum in the Apalachicola area are only about an inch apart. And actually, they're about an inch and a half apart in Cedar Key. So when I was saying about a 6 to 7 foot storm tide, I think that would be actually pushing that much water on towards land. And so we could see, I think, some pretty substantial flooding in those areas. Looking at Cedar Key, this is again a faithful NOAA gauge that is predicting water levels in blue, measuring actual water levels in red. We already see a 2-foot storm surge here as of early this afternoon, and this was taking the absolute water levels up to around 4 feet above NAVD 88. Looking at our Cedar Key climatology that's recently been produced on the USurge website, we see, I want to talk about 3 events in the history of Cedar Key. The 2 highest storm tide events happened in the late 1800s. We had unnamed storms in 1888 and 1896, and then Hurricane Alma in 1966 produced a storm tide of slightly more than 8 feet. And so this is a track of Alma. Alma was a major hurricane, Category 3 off the southwest coast of Florida. We can do a Category 2 here as it approached Apalachicola. Cedar Key is right in here. And again, we had one of these shelf waves, which happens in areas, especially when a hurricane is paralleling a coast. It can happen in Southwest Australia. It can happen here in Florida, where water gets trapped between the storm and the coast. And I think that's partly why Alma had such a high storm tide in 1966. Hermine should be a little bit different. It's not really paralleling the coast. It's kind of moving in here a little bit at more of an angle. This is what I'm thinking, though, as far as Hermine's forecast. The water levels as of early this afternoon we already had a 3.8-foot storm tide above NAVD 88, with more than a day of onshore winds, including Cedar Key almost certainly staying on the strong side of the storm. I really see no reason that we couldn't build up at least 3 to 4 more feet of storm surge, which would give us a total water level elevation here of 7 to 8 feet. So again, that's almost approaching Alma's level in 1966. I don't have maps to show you, but what I do have to show you is Tropical Storm Colin in June produced a storm tide level of around 5.17 feet. And so we do have pictures of that on the USurge website. So again, this just happened in June. I think that the storm tide with Hermine could be at least 2 feet higher than this. And so we have some pics and video on USurge, and you can see, these women were walking in water up to their ankles. The water could be, I think, at least 2 feet higher than that in Hermine. So again, we're looking at some fairly substantial flooding along the Big Bend area of Florida. This is the National Hurricane Center product that looks at inundation above ground level. We see a lot of blue, yellow, and oranges. I was really happy to see some oranges in here. That's talking about water levels at least 6 feet above ground level, which is fairly substantial. Again, if you're not elevated at that level, you're drowning. So this is some substantial flooding in here with many of these communities. Many of these areas are rural. Here's Homosassa Springs, Cedar Key in here. I think that these levels they make a lot of sense to me after spending about 7 or 8 years building these climatologies. I think that they're really right on with this prediction, and really we need to be concerned and take precautions in areas like around Cedar Key. Again, usurge.net, go to it, check it out. I would love to get your pictures, your videos, your stories on this website. Also, I'm working with the Galveston Historical Foundation, and not only am I interested in how high water is going to get, I'm interested in the impacts of that water, and particularly things like beyond protecting life and property, what about really special places like historic places that once they're flooded, they're lost forever. If you're interested in historic preservation and saving historic locations from sea level rise and storm surge, give me a shout. I'd love to collaborate with you on projects. Also, if you're concerned about flooding at your property or your facility, whether it's in Florida or up the East Coast, whether it's in Hermine or some storm in the future, give me a shout. On nights and weekends, I'm doing some consulting work with disastermap.net and Marine Weather and Climate, and we're actually doing some location-based storm surge risk for specific storms. So we can do a specific report for Tropical Storm Hermine or any other storm in the future, looking at what is your actual risk at your address. Give me a shout. My name again is Dr. Hal Needham. I'm at hal@marineweatherandclimate.com or hal.needham@galvestonhistory.org. My Twitter handle is hal_Needham, or you can just find me on Facebook at Hal Needham. I hope to update this with some analog storms, looking at the tracks and the storm surge heights that have happened historically, especially ones that resemble Hermine. So look for me tomorrow. I'm going to try to get some of that out on Thursday, September 1st. So again, stay safe, everybody, and hopefully there'll be minimal amount of loss to property and hopefully no loss of life in the storm. I'll look for an update tomorrow, and thanks again for watching.